Hey, everybody. Really exciting sessions throughout the entire day. And I'm really excited to be winding down our data summit with a pretty remarkable person who has had a tremendous amount of experience in and around the data industry for quite a long time. So I'm really pleased to be joined by DJ Patil, who's held a variety of different roles across academia, industry, and government. He's currently a board member for Devoted Health, a senior fellow at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School, and an advisor to Venrock Partners. One of the things I think is so exciting about DJ's experience is this incredible background in both industry and in government. And when we think about DJ's experiences here, he was appointed by President Obama to be the first US chief data scientist, where his efforts led the establishment of nearly 40 chief data officer roles across federal government. He's also served in new healthcare programs, including the Precision Medicine Initiative and the Cancer Moonshot, the new criminal reforms, including the Data-Driven Justice and Police Data Initiatives that cover more than 94 million Americans, as well as leading the national data efforts. He's also been active in the national security for his efforts and was awarded the Secretary Carter the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, which is the highest honor civilian can be bestowed. On the industry side, DJ has been the CTO of Devoted Health. He's led product teams at RelateIQ, which was acquired by Salesforce, was a founding board member for the Crisis Text Line, which works to use new technologies to provide on-demand mental and crisis support, and was also a member of the venture firm Greylock Partners. He also was chief scientist, chief security officer, and the head of analytics and data products for LinkedIn, and has co-coined the term data scientist. DJ has a very broad and robust background, and I'm so excited, DJ. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. It's great to be here, and sad we can't be here in person, but at least we get to have a conversation this way, and on so many exciting topics.
I know we have so much to talk about, so I'm really excited to dive in on this. So one of the things that I want to anchor a little bit of this conversation on, almost 10 years ago now, you wrote this article, Data Scientist, the sexiest job of the 21st century. I think it was spot on, and as far as I've heard, it's one of the most read HBR articles of all time. What I would love to dive into, walk us through some of your journey that led up to that article, because we got a whole host of things to talk about after. But I first want to really dive into that part of your journey. But what led you to write that article to begin with?
Yeah, what's crazy to me is it's Harvard Business Review is about to have their 100th that's a significant anniversary. It's not 100 years old, but they're about to, and they talked about their 100 most read articles, and this is in there. And so I think we need to get a few things out of the way first. We cannot take credit for actually titling that article. They did that. We had a more data-centric title, but clearly Harvard Business Review has figured out how to make clickbait. And one of the things I think that they really realized, and the genesis of writing this article along with Tom Davenport, was that while those of us who had been really in the weeds of working with data, we could see the potential. Companies, CEOs, board members, investors were not seeing the potential. And one of the things that was very important for me prior to doing this article was we saw this benefit that was happening at LinkedIn. People were using it at Facebook. There were so many other places people were using this in national security. There was lots of places where this was popping up. But what we saw over and over again is that people, the data scientists, the people who were working with the data, were swimming upstream. And we thought, what if we could write something that would just make their lives easier, their ability to argue why they have value, why people should make investments in the products or ideas that they have and invest. Back then it would be, if you said, hey, I need more than one data tool, they'd be like, why? You're just doing data. Maybe that tool is only Excel. Maybe it's, something else that you just doesn't meet the needs. And this really in a fascinating way, because I was not convinced of this. Tom really is the one that drove this, was like, you're going to see a shift happen because the type of readership they have. Something else that was really important for me was to tell the story of Jonathan Goldman in that story. And Jonathan's the data scientist who came up with the idea of people you know, to really emphasize that the entire trajectory of a company, an industry even, could be transformed by one data scientist. It obviously takes a team of data scientists to make things real, but the genesis of the power of the people who work with data can transform things in novel, unbelievable ways.
Very, very cool. And one of the things that reminds me of too, you've held remarkable positions at remarkable scale, both in large scale tech companies and of course in government, which is probably the largest job with largest scale of all. Give folks a sense of, when we talk about impact, what are we talking here? What are the big problems that people are solving today, and how is data influencing that?
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you asked that. One of the things that I think we see now with data is the leverage that you can create. And one side of that leverage, we often think like, oh, wow, I need to have a large company footprint to do something. I need to be at a Google, an Amazon, a Facebook size scale to have impact. And that's false. You can be in the government and transform the world. Simple questions that are asked on the census have an impact for a decade, and they have unbelievable impacts downstream. Something simple as, oh, how do you want to be defined? What's gender? Maybe you don't want to be defined by gender. Maybe that doesn't fit you. What about other questions about your ethnicity? What if you're from one region or another? Those have cascading impacts about how we actually allocate our dollars from the federal government that transforms local communities. And so just being able to change a little bit, a tiny little bit in the government has massive outcomes. That's not the only place. Today is, at least the day we're speaking on this, is the anniversary of when we started talking to the California government about COVID and COVID response and how to think about it. And what we've seen in that moment of time, as people came together, and that was those 2 years ago around COVID, you saw data scientists who were this unbelievable new kind of first responder. People set up things like the COVID tracking project. People set up all these models like COVID Act Now, all these other models. You had people like Kit Rodolpha, Josh Wills, who built the COVID models along with Justin Lessiter and his team out of Johns Hopkins University to really help figure out the California policies. And so you had these citizen scientists, data scientists, who showed up and transformed our understanding and our ability to manage that crisis in those first days. You're seeing similar things happen right now in Ukraine, and we've seen it happen around other disasters like tsunamis all the way through to hurricanes. And so the ability for a data scientist to take their skills, take their passions, put a through line between those to have unbelievable impact is a transformative thing that we really haven't seen for generations. And it's just beginning. And then with that comes unbelievable responsibility as well, because we have to think about, how are we going to manifest? How are we going to use those skills? How do we maximize a positive beneficial value for everyone that this could impact?
Yeah, so that actually leads to a couple of really interesting questions here. And one thing that I wanted to tap into was this great quote you had, which is, when we talk about data science, it was, to paraphrase, difficult and expensive to hire and find these people. And the market is very competitive for their services because there is this gap, basically, in the supply and the demand curve. Is that changing when we talk about these really powerful, really compelling skills? Is that changing today? And which direction is it going? Or is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Are we finding our ability to impact the world around us is accelerating in a good way?
It's a great question, because one of the things I think that we've seen as data science, the idea of data science is really fascinating because people think like, oh, it's something brand new. I mean, the Mayans were doing data science as they were looking at the stars and with, East Asia and the Indus Valley. Like, so people have been doing sort of forms of deep computations, processing data, and they were only limited by the scale of their ability to do computing plus, the other broad analysis tools and technologies. What we've seen at this moment of time is that we now have cloud computing. We have the ability to have large storage of data. We have accessibility of data. You can go to data.gov at the US government level and get all this unbelievable amount of data to investigate, process, transparency. All these things are happening. What we've also seen is that the tool chain, the processes, the techniques that are needed to make that data useful, those have been a challenge and have been continually evolved upon. Cleaning data, still very challenging. Making sure to understand, like, what do we do there? How do we have visibility? All those types of things. We have the increased portions of this where we say, hey, how do I go from this step of the ETL, the extract, transform, load process, to this step, to this step? And that's predominantly one of the value propositions that Ascend provides. We have this kind of idea of well, how do we fire the data scientists out of the crappy jobs so they can actually do the job that they should be doing, which is insights, building things with the data, turning this into the magic that can really add value for other things. That process, those tools, has fostered a whole wide array of new skills and technologies. When Kafka was being built out at LinkedIn, there was really no idea at that point of data engineer as well. There was just kind of the data team, if you will, like that was one broad team. And what do we call ourselves? All these things. When Confluent, we spun up Confluent as a company outside of, from the use of technology like Kafka, that sort of was this beginning moment. People are like, oh, there are data engineers. We've seen similar things as the data sets become larger. How do you know who's the steward of these things? Who's that adjudicator? And we realize, oh, there needs to probably be some data steward, and there's different versions of that term. There's data ops that have now started to take place. And so what I envision happening is a wider array of titles that are going to emerge, a wider array of skill sets as we become more sophisticated with the data world. And so what one area needs versus another is going to change on the nature of the problem that they have and the types of solutions that they need to deliver at that moment in time. So you could have very different types of roles over time. So what does this mean in terms of our demand curve and how do we think about it? It just means it's getting richer and more challenging. In the same way that you don't just say, oh, I just need an engineer. You kind of ask, well, what kind of engineer do you want? Do you want a computer scientist? Do you want a civic engineer? Do you want an electrical engineer? Oh, by the way, if you're talking about software development, what do we want? Front end, back end? Like, there's a lot of richness as we realize, like, this is the problem we're trying to solve.
That's really interesting because we've seen this move happen, and I think we might have even it certainly was coined first in data science, which was that citizen data scientist, which are people coming from adjacent spaces. But we saw it go from engineering and quant and physics to more people being able to be effective in different parts of the ecosystem with expanded tooling and capabilities. And I think you're touching on something that's really interesting too, which is as we expand in that data ecosystem, the tool chain is maturing and it's evolving, and you no longer have to go spin up your Kafka and Spark clusters and tune the JVM to eat the last little bit of performance out, like when we were all kids trying to get the last bit of memory for the video game we wanted to play. And so now the technology stack continues to move up. And I love that notion of we are greatly expanding the talent pool, and so many more people can contribute to the data ecosystem, the data strategy.
Yeah.
And so
just to pause on that for a second.
Yeah.
Kind of go back to when I was getting started in this stuff and I was trying to just originally play with data. to try to find patterns in weather data. Back then, I had to figure out how to even put multiple machines together to get the job done. I had to figure out how to shell script, do all this crazy stuff to get this to work, how to move files around just to parse things. And then a lot of stuff I had to do is when I was building my own machines, I had to know like what bay configurations were there for the drives, what the backplane looked like, all this stuff that no one needs to know that. No one needs to care what type of hard drives are on there, what type of RAM, like all this other stuff is there. We've been freed of that because there's a whole specialty of that. What we need to do is that same way, we need to look back over time and be like, remember how quaint it was that you had to do it that way? That was sort of silly, wasn't it? That's what evolution looks like in this process. And you have different people on the team who carry different skills really have different skills and are able to apply them with that unique value.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. Something you and I have spoken about in the past too. What do you do when you're a team that has invested and that you were an early adopter and you did build out that strategic advantage, right? Being one of the first to adopt cloud technology, strategic advantage, being one of the first to adopt Kafka or Spark, strategic advantage. Over time, as you see commoditization and standardization across the industry, it starts to get a little bit less differentiating. How do you think about that? Because I mean, you predominantly are the driver of innovation, but also work at massive scale and impact, and so have seen teams go through this life cycle. How do you think about that and continue to drive innovation for prolonged periods of time?
Yeah, we should go into this at length, because when we had this conversation a few weeks ago, part of this, it's something that's really I've been thinking a lot about, and I think there's a lot of merit for the way you've been arguing it. And it's one of the things that I've reflected on is in the arc of things that I've been able to work with, I have always tried not to invent new technology. Which seems to make it a little counter because it's really expensive. There was a saying that my dad taught me, which is you don't want to be on the bleeding edge. And because you're going to get cut. It's not good to be on the cutting, bleeding edge. You want to be one step back if you can. And then if all your stuff is cutting edge, bleeding edge stuff, it's very fragile. It's very expensive. And so you want to have only a couple bets at a time where that is going to be your differentiator. So as a result, we're oftentimes trying not to do that. We're trying to use somebody else's solutions up till the breaking point. And then we kind of say, hey, there's no alternative here. We are just going to have to do this. There is no other way out. And at which point, then we take it on and we're like, oh, this is going to suck because it's really hard. It's really difficult. And then you're stuck with it. And it's unbelievably hard to take it out, even when you're like, no one wants it anymore. Everyone's like, look, we graduated. They do it better than us. Why are we doing this? And no engineer is just like, great, I want to get up at 3 a.m. every night kicking this machine just because I'm the one stuck on duty, versus if we brought this other service in, we'd be freed up from it. We oftentimes look at the cost structure. The cost structure of building Kafka was at least 3 FTE for the first several years. And that's incredibly expensive. Now, why did we do it? Well, we couldn't afford the costs of Splunk anymore. And it wasn't meeting the exact needs for us. We had some very specific needs. But did we try all these other solutions? Absolutely. We couldn't afford TIBCO. There was a lot of other choices that just no longer worked. The same was true as everyone jumped into Hadoop. There were no other solutions out there for us. We tried all of them. We had contracts with many of the other companies. We tried to scale and then they wouldn't be able to keep up, or the versatile types of use cases. So we had to invent our own stuff. but the invention was often our last resort. And because we had tried everything, we had a very crisp mental model of what we needed to do. We weren't just meandering, trying to create tech for the sake of tech. We knew we had to nail a specific problem. And so that kept us laser focused and able to often be able to nail it. The other thing that people don't realize is we worked very hard at not doing this alone. So we weren't just saying, hey, like if this was a LinkedIn example, we weren't just saying like, what should we do for LinkedIn? We would talk all the time to friends at other companies and be like, hey, so we're trying to do this. What are you guys doing? And so that allowed us to kind of coalesce and put more water in the harbor around specific issues and float all boats. And so this ethos of this data science really being a team sport was embodied in this movement around even the creation of technology.
That's really cool to hear. And I think one of the really interesting things I'm keen to explore with you too, when we think about data scientists and there not being enough of them and technology continuing to evolve, how have you thought about in the past, as we have many executives and data team leads, obviously that are attending this conference, and they're looking for some of that guidance too. How have you thought about the notion of build versus buy? And you talked a little bit about that. How do I only innovate if you have to, if it's a strategic differentiator? How do you also think about how do I get out of it once I'm doing it and I'm now have my system? These are really talented, really expensive, never mind just the salaries, like the opportunity cost so incredibly high. How do you get folks out of like maintaining the things that are no longer differentiated? What would be your guidance to leaders there?
Yeah, so I'm looking for a couple things always. The first is I'm always trying to fire my teams out of their job. Because if we have an ethos of like fire ourselves out of the job, it gives us the freedom and the luxury to move to other problems. When we nail a problem in a company, or you kind of get it, you get a different level of credibility, because we were like, oh, that team, they did that, they delivered that. And so it's no longer, it's the same thing if you're a vendor solution. You're just like, you develop a reputation of like, oh, they solve your problem. The joke used to be at the beginning, or the tagline for the LinkedIn analytics team was literally, we called ourselves the A team. And it was modeled after the A team. It was like, if you can find us and you can hire us, we will solve your problem. And that was the joke. And the question was like, what problems do we select? But we had this very strong ethos of delivering. And so we developed this reputation. And I strongly say we, because it was a cadre of people from Monica Ragati to Shirley Zhao to Catherine to Jonathan Goldman, Steve Stegman. There's so many people who had this ethos of innovation that they drove it, that they drove these ideas and they'd solve them. And then we'd be able to say, wow, we solved that. We got a lot of context. What's next? And then because we had so much context, we had so much credibility, we're able to go after bigger problems. When Chris Riccomini, Jay Krebs, Neha Narkade, Jun Rao, all of them were kind of like playing around with the ideas of the log layer and the analytics, because we had credibility, I could go to the executive team and the board and say, hey, I want to make this big bet. And this big, it's going to cost a lot of the team to do this. And it's crazy. And I had to have the rest of engineering buy-in. I had to have operations buy-in, but we could only do that because they said, oh yeah, okay, that team, they can get it done. If you try to go off right away and bite off something big, it's very hard. And by the way, I am practicing what I preach even when I went to the White House. It's not like I was like, and then we're going to go do this massive thing. And everyone's like, what? That's not going to happen. We had to prove value. I had to prove value to the rest of the president's staff, including the president. I had to prove value to Congress. I had to prove value to local constituencies, particularly mayors and governors, even police chiefs, other people, so that we could then work together. And that meant sometimes that we were starting a little bit smaller, and that we'd start with something that was just easy. And we had a framing that we used. We said, we try to prototype for 1x, we build for 10x scale, and then engineer for 100x scale. But we're starting at the 1x and then sort of moving up. And there's plenty of projects that we just said, we're not going to do that project. We don't have the time. We don't have the energy. We're not ready for it. We can't run a marathon just tomorrow because we're still working on getting our, to 10K.
I love that. I love that. And, fun fact, one of the core values inside of Ascend is build for 10x, plan for 100x. I might have to borrow some of that prototype for 1x as well. I really like that.
But and it's this amazing thing that I think you see in teams is oftentimes when you're really close to problems, a lot of times you have trouble judging scale. And sometimes you need somebody else to say, hey, have you thought about this? I had a great one early in the, when I was in government in this time around. I got pulled aside and somebody said, hey, you know what? You're thinking in the billions of dollar range. Your job is to think about problems that impact trillions of dollars. And I realized, I was like, wow, what does that even mean? I was like, well, I don't even understand, trillion, what the hell is a $1 trillion problem? And so we looked at it and I was like, oh, you know what? This became our framing for the problems we chose, which was we work on problems that are $1 trillion or more of impact to the US, to the US government or population, impacts 50% of the population, or impacts a population that has no recourse. So what are problems in that bucket? Healthcare. We're almost approaching 20% of GDP. We're not just, we're unbelievable cost structure there. Also the percentage of people that are impacted. But problems like policing easily get to that $1 trillion marker, but also 50% of the population. And then there's problems like no recourse. What do you think about is the dignity for a person who's transgender, who's going through a scanner at TSA, and the scanner can't figure out, it has a gender thing and it is stopping them for no good reason. Yet we can do AI to figure out how to make a self-driving car go through very complex situations. We can't figure out how TSA scanners to provide dignity. That is a failure of technology when we could easily come up with good solutions.
I really love that. And I think this becomes pretty compelling when we start to think of more and more volumes of data, more and more people able to really marshal it in pretty compelling ways. So as we start to look forward, what's in our way? What's slowing down progress today?
Well, I think a few things that are there. The first, it comes down to we are leaving 50% of our team off the field, and that is women. 50% of the team. We have pay inequities. We do a terrible job at fostering STEM, science, technology, math, engineering, education for women and girls, especially K through 12, and then even further drop off at collegiate levels. So we're not doing a good enough job with 50% of our team. And if we bolster that, we dramatically change the game in terms of quality for products, ideas. Thinking would be better overall. We've seen it that mixed gender teams outperform single gender teams. That's the first part. Second part is, I think we have a real reckoning about how do we want to think about our overall approach with ethics. What is acceptable? What is responsible? In some ways, we are oftentimes getting in the way of ourselves as we try to figure out how we're going to do these things. We're seeing ways that people are abusing technology, abusing scandals, and that sets back the whole field because people have less trust. And trust is a form of trust, I think, that is okay to think about. Really, we should think about it is consistency over time. So when a company has your data, what is consistent about it? Well, what's consistent right now is it's going to get stolen or it's breach, or they're not going to treat it like they should treat their own family's data. So we got to get over that. The other portion of this is, I think what we need to get to is like, what does good training look like? What does it really look like? And I think one of the beautiful things that we see is that we see all these people are incredibly excited to use data, whether you want to call it data science, computer science, math, statistics. I don't personally care. I think it's just awesome that people want to use math and all these other skills to figure out how to solve problems. How do we give them the basic skill sets to be applicable? What does that look like in terms of training? And a bunch of that comes down to some very basic things that people don't think about. Speech, communication, liberal arts. If we put those things in our curriculums, you would see a dramatic change. Why? Because the number of times where I see somebody have a great idea and they can't communicate it, they can't get the buy-in, they can't get the feedback that they deserve. That's where we break. That's where our models break, that people are often thinking like, no, we just need to teach more vector calculus to people. And Sean, you're an example of this. Like as a founder, you're working on an incredibly hard idea. Your ability to explain not just to customers, but to investors, but to the spouses of a person that's joining the team, you have to help them see why this is a journey that they should commit the majority of their time to on a given day. That requires a crispness and clarity thing. And I'm sure you've seen this many times. It's like sometimes somebody's like, well, what about this? And you're like, ooh, I'm going to have to take a rain check on that, because you just like, that is a really deep, profound question.
Yeah, well, I think this touches on so many really cool themes. First, I would say, we're in this really interesting space where we've seen this acceleration of technology. I think the ethics part that you mentioned is really interesting, which is, in those early days in building out these technologies, there was a fundamental dampener on the pace of innovation because you were building out so much more technology. And so, there's that old saying that in the pursuit of figuring out if you could do something, you were afforded enough time to figure out if you should do it as well. And in this sort of accelerating world, we're getting access to such more powerful technologies so much quicker that oftentimes we're finding companies aren't asking if they should do things, so they're collecting a lot of data. But I think that gets to the second thing you were talking about, which is we don't have trust uniformly built yet, as there's a value mismatch right now. And I think it's getting better, but companies have collected tons of data, but oftentimes haven't provided sufficient value back to consumers in a fair, open, and transparent way. And so I think that becomes really, I'm with you 100%. And then the third thing that I really love diving into more is, as we see this democratization, which I'm going to paraphrase and simplify down, but the democratization of the skills required, it allows diversification of backgrounds. And if we get that, we can start to pull in so much more diverse backgrounds of people who can articulate the value, who are closer to the user or the beneficiary of technology. And in doing so, we benefit not just the practitioners who are helping us build these incredible products, but everybody that these products are in theory designed for. And so I love that trend. How do we make it go faster?
Well, here's some simple ones that we could do. The first is, and something that I've called on for years, and unfortunately we haven't made enough progress on this. Every data scientist in their training programs, collegiate, boot camps, whatever it is, needs to have ethics integrated into their curriculum, not just like some side project. Ethics needs to be integrated through every aspect of it. So that's the first. The analogy here is, if you learned about database design and you didn't learn about the ways that your database could be attacked, or your design structures have security vulnerabilities, you really shouldn't be designing databases right now. Because it's like, there's sort of like, it's like the equivalent of like, don't design a boat if you don't know how to make sure the hull is going to be watertight. It's like 101 right now. So the same way, we need to have that basic ethics framework in place. Two is, and we've put this together in a free ebook, Hillary Mason, Mike Lukides, myself, and download it from wherever, Amazon or O'Reilly. And what we try to lay out is our practitioner guide for some of these things. And another one is like, everybody should ask when they interview, how do you handle ethical issues? You know, if you ask those questions and every employer is like, hey, they keep asking us that would change. Just same way, like if everybody employee say, hey, how do you handle equity of pay? Things would change. So we need to see that kind of movement. There's another thing though in there, which is I think where the automation comes in is, and this isn't just a single solution, it's an in addition to all these things, is like, how do we start to build safeguards into our technology? Just like we're trying to fire ourselves out of a job, how can we use that? And that may not just be universal solutions, but maybe it's some things that say, hey, we have an outlier here. Maybe we have something else here that's not feeling great and we should look at it. It warrants some type of investigation or oversight question. Those things are all acceptable as well. And I believe that we should have many more of those kind of ideas and thought process in there. The other one that I wish we would see much more of is, and companies need to do is that the data scientists really need to be on the front lines, engaged with customers, engaged with people to see who they impact, but also in the meetings where decisions are being made. A lot of times we blame this on the data people, but they're so far removed from the decision-making process, they don't get to voice their concern. And you're seeing this in some of these whistleblower cases. Stuff is just kind of coming down and they're just a piece of a cog in the whole system. And then they're like, whoa, that's what happened? I didn't expect that. But as you point out, Sean, the amount of commoditization of these technologies, the amount of democratization of these tools, we need to get a firm hold on this. Otherwise, we will see much more aggressive direct policy interventions that will become much more challenging. It'll be much more challenging to work with data, expensive to work with data, because we will have not proven to be good stewards of people's data.
You know, we're not going to have enough time to tackle all of these, but you hit a couple of things that I'm so excited to unpack a little bit more. I'm very interested in the automation angle. And I know we're at the Data Automation Summit, but I'm going to actually go the other direction too. You know, one of the things you talked
about. We'll have to save it for not just the first Automation Summit, but the second Data Automation
one
Summit also.
Definitely. So, you know, the other thing that you mentioned here is around having more of a strategic seat at the table. And oftentimes we've seen those in data roles, whether it's as a chief data scientist, as a chief data officer. Oftentimes these are new roles, and we see, I mean, obviously you were the first chief data scientist and started just to set that standard and helped create so many chief data officer roles across the country. And we see this in industry too. And one of the things that I certainly observe is these emerging CDOs. You know, sometimes and oftentimes they have a combination of data science and data engineering and data platforming. And oftentimes they're coming up through the ranks, right? Directors to VPs, and as they start to hit the C level, we see this tipping point where, you know, the adage is, are they going the way of the CIO or the CMO? Are they going to become a cost center or a profit center? How strategic of a seat are they going to get at the table? And, you know, I think it's really important for the CDOs as they emerge to become incredibly strategic because they affect such important outcomes. You know, as you're looking out to a massive audience, virtual in this case, but a massive audience of, you know, both present and future chief data officers, what is your guidance to them on how to become critically important as we drive and critically important in becoming a key member of that strategic circle inside of their companies?
What a great question. You know, there's a lot in there, because the first part is the CIO role has become bogged down. It's become this catch-all for all these other things, the compliance, the finance. And so like a lot of times really people are unhappy with the CIO, and you kind of say, does the CIO really want to do all these things? They're going to be forced to do all these things. And the chief data officer is kind of like the CIO of the original time. And it's like, well, we had to relabel something because the new CIOs are really CFOs of IT centers, cost centers. They don't get to be the innovation portion of this problem. The way I would encourage people to think about things is, I have found it very unhelpful to try to argue why I should be at the table because of my title. The title, and the data scientist title in particular, I think the reason it has taken off, because our goal wasn't to label something, but the reason it's taken off is because people are a little bit not sure what it is. Actually, oftentimes they have no idea what it is. But then they're like, oh, you're smart and you're here in this room. Of course, you should stay here. But if you were like, hey, I'm the business analyst, I'd be like, why are you here? That sort of ambiguity, then suddenly they're like, oh my gosh, you can do these things? You're invaluable. So the way I'd almost position it is, what's the minimum title that gives you an excuse to get context or be in the room? And so you do need title. I don't want to say title is irrelevant. And so being the US Chief Data Scientist gave me an excuse to be in some meetings. But it's not like I just got to be in the meetings. What my job was in those meetings was to find a way to add value. And then if I disproportionately, for lack of a better term, get a 5-star review or, have an unbelievable batting average constantly, people are like, would we have a meeting and be like, why isn't DJ here? Like, isn't this a thing? Like, why, like, this seems like a data thing. Like, where's DJ? We need to get his opinion. Then you're being pulled into meetings. If you're finding yourself being like, you're having to push to open doors, there's almost a jujitsu argument that you have to figure out culturally, how do you change that? Some of that might be, you need to find a problem that sucks for another team and use your skills and your team's skills to solve the problem for them. And now they're like, oh my gosh, they're the best thing since sliced bread. We need to go work with them more often. And every place I've been, including LinkedIn to the White House, every place has been consistently the same, where you start out on the outside of meetings and you got to work your way in. In LinkedIn, it was the same way. Like, I had to prove viability. And it's like, when I say it is a team that is doing this. Same way with the White House team. Like Lynn Overman and Denise Ross, who's the current US Chief Data Scientist, and Clarence Wardell and so many others, they had these ideas around policing, and that gives us an opportunity. We could be in the room, but then suddenly we had these ideas, we had to execute on them. And then we started executing on them, and we're like, oh my gosh, maybe we should go with what they're doing. And so now suddenly we were a critical asset. And there's a law article that President Obama wrote at the end of this administration that highlights all the things you do that would have done. And there's a significant portion of them that are all evolve around data and technology. And it was that what we really was that partnership that emerged. And the title, an excuse to have a conversation, to get into occasional meetings, but it's what we delivered that got us there. And if the organization, I'll be very blunt, if the organization is a type that will not let you into the room or will not support, you have to decide if it's worth your time. Some places it is because it's a crisis like COVID or something else, and you just need to break through the wall no matter what. And you just have to keep going at it. There's other times where you say, look, if this is an organization that is not going to value you or be able to utilize your own skills, then really honestly need to ask yourself if this is the place where you should use your skills maximally. And that sometimes is a hard message to hear, but I would tell everybody out there, your skills and the ability of how you spend your time is the most valuable commodity you have. And there are so many problems out there in the world that are waiting for someone like you to be able to take your skills and apply it and make a critical difference to somebody else or some population or some future population.
Wow, what a great piece of advice that, as we wrap this up, the sheer abundance of opportunities for us to go change the world. And it sounds like even more so now, the world is valuing the pragmatic leaders who just drive value and can drive impact quickly, given the sheer abundance of opportunity. I like that. That's really cool. That takes us to the end of our time. What a fantastic way of wrapping up our summit here. DJ, really appreciate it. Just absolute wisdom. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing that with our audience. And
My
can't
pleasure.
wait to do this
Thanks
again.
for having me.
Absolutely.